But I do think that the Supergirl is apart because she's not she's not so much like Superman. She's very, very different.
James Gunn had one job when Warner Brothers and DC Studios handed him the keys to one of the most valuable superhero franchises on Earth. He was brought in specifically because he had done it before. Built Guardians of the Galaxy from a property nobody outside of comic book stores had heard of into a billion-dollar cultural moment twice, then done it again with the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker for DC. He understood the assignment. The assignment was simple: fix DC, make it work again. Do what Kevin Feige did for Marvel, except do it faster, because DC was already bleeding market share and audience goodwill, and the window was closing. He arrived at DC Studios in October 2022, alongside Peter Safran, and the two of them immediately began dismantling what had come before and building something new. They canceled projects in development. They cleared out the Zack Snyder-era continuity that had generated as many passionate detractors as devoted fans. They announced a slate they called Gods and Monsters, 10 projects across film and television, a structured plan for a unified DC universe built from the ground up, with creative coherence as the stated priority. Gunn said repeatedly and publicly that the difference between what DC had been and what he was building was going to start with the writing. No more going into production on half-written screenplays. No more volume over quality. The stories would be ready before cameras rolled, or they wouldn't roll. The first film in his new DCU, Superman, released in 2025 with David Cornswet in the title role, was not a disaster. Critics liked it. Audiences showed up, more or less. The discourse about whether it actually made money has been running ever since, with analysts splitting on the accounting, the studio insisting it was a success, and outside observers suggesting the numbers fell short of the threshold that a $225 million production with a $125 million marketing spend required to be genuinely profitable. Superman opened to $125 million domestically and topped out at $618 million worldwide. Most analysts said it broke even on paper with limited upside. Some said it lost money. Nobody called it a franchise launching triumph. None of that mattered compared to what Supergirl just did. Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, opened on June 26, 2026. It made $37 million in North America and $62 million worldwide in its opening weekend, against a reported production budget of between $170 and $186 million. A global marketing spend of approximately $120 million, and an additional $100 million promotional partner campaign that DC described as a record for the franchise. The break-even point, the number the film needed to reach in its entire theatrical run before Warner Brothers stopped losing money, was $315 million worldwide. For comparison, Superman had opened to double this film's worldwide opening in its first weekend alone. Then Supergirl dropped 74% in its second weekend. Industry sources are estimating a loss of $125 million. Variety called the performance super horrendous. The film is currently tracking toward a total worldwide run somewhere between $63 million and $83 million. A range of outcomes where the floor is essentially the production budget divided by 5. And while Gunn has not issued the kind of dramatic public meltdown that the title of this video suggests he did, what has happened in the weeks since the bomb landed is something that may ultimately prove more damaging. The entire apparatus of right-wing media, legacy Superman actors, frustrated Hollywood filmmakers, culture war YouTube channels, and his own studio's internal communications has collectively taken the DCU's second film apart in public piece by piece in ways that no single press statement could address. This is the full account of how it happened. The star who made it worse. Before a single frame of Supergirl was shown to a general audience, before the tracking numbers came in, before any critic had written a review, Millie Alcock had already become the most discussed element of the film's pre-release period, and not in the way Warner Brothers had planned. Alcock is, by any reasonable assessment, a talented actor. Her work as young Rhaenyra Targaryen in House of the Dragon was the kind of breakout performance that makes studios sit up and think about casting that person in something large before someone else does. James Gunn sat up. He cast her as Kara Zor-El before Supergirl even had a director, introducing the character in a post-credits sequence in Superman where a drunk Kara crashed into the Fortress of Solitude after partying on a red sun planet. The introduction was designed to establish this Supergirl as messier, harder-edged, and less conventionally heroic than any previous cinematic version of the character. What nobody at Warner Brothers apparently prepared adequately for was the press tour. In March 2026, Alcock gave an interview to Vanity Fair in which she described what she had learned from her time as a woman working in genre franchise media. She said it had made her aware that simply existing as a woman in that space is something that people comment on. She added, "We have become very comfortable having this weird ownership of women's bodies. I can't really stop them. I can only be myself." The comments were not incendiary in their intent. She was describing a pattern of online attention that anyone in her position, a young woman cast as a beloved superhero character in a reboot, would recognizably experience. What happened next was the pattern she had just described, arriving on cue. A significant segment of online commentary, primarily from male accounts, responded to a quote about men commenting on women's existence by commenting on a woman's existence in a way that appeared to confirm her observation in real time. Alcock saw this, went to Variety, and did not back down. She said, "I didn't even say men. I said people." And they got so angry. I was like, "You're proving my point." She then delivered the line that the culture war content ecosystem screen-grabbed and distributed for 2 consecutive news cycles. And the backlash is from a lot of people whose profiles have no photo, who are burner accounts, or someone's name and then dad of 4, Christian, which is hilarious to me. But whose opinion do you really care about? If you're pissing the right kind of people off, you're doing okay. The phrase dad of 4, Christian became the Supergirl press tour's defining moment before the film had screened anywhere. Outkick ran it as evidence of a star insulting her potential audience. Fox News panels discussed it as a symptom of Hollywood's fundamental disconnect from the people who buy movie tickets. The tracking numbers, already softening from a May high of $65 million projected for opening weekend, began dropping further. By the time Alcock confirmed in a Queerly radio interview that Supergirl would probably go both ways, offering her personal read on the character's sexuality in a response that was framed as open-ended but was received as a confirmation of queer coding. The die had been cast. Fox News ran the post-mortem on air. Jesse Waters and Greg Gutfeld discussed the projected $200 million loss in the context of the bisexual confirmation and what they described as Gunn's woke agenda. Dean Cain, who played Superman in the 90s and has positioned himself as a vocal critic of the current DCU's ideological direction since at least 2025, reappeared to tie the box office result to the thematic choices. The Get Woke, Go Broke narrative assembled itself with the efficiency of an apparatus that had been waiting for exactly this outcome. But the trade analysis told a more complicated story. The woke label and what actually went wrong. The industry postmortems from Deadline, Variety, and The Hollywood Reporter produced a diagnosis of Supergirl's failure that only partially overlapped with the culture war account. The first and most important factor was IP recognition. Supergirl has never been a character with genuine mainstream cultural presence outside of dedicated comic book readers, and people old enough to remember the 1984 Salkin production, which was itself a box office bomb. Unlike Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, or even Iron Man before the MCU, Supergirl has never generated the kind of event-level cultural footprint that translates into opening weekend walk-up ticket sales. The analyst Jeff Bach of Exhibitor Relations told Variety directly, this was always going to be a tough hurdle for DC and Warner Brothers, because Supergirl isn't a character that has ever created an event-level blockbuster. The second factor was the test screening data. Supergirl went through more than 10 test screenings with 3 different endings and 3 different composers, and its runtime came down approximately 25 minutes from a January cut to the final release version of 1 hour and 48 minutes. The internal read on the film coming away from testing was described by multiple sources using the same phrase: good, not great. A studio insider told Deadline, "Good, not great doesn't cut it. You can't get away with it. The fans will have their knives out for you." The tracking data reflected this internal assessment. Supergirl's first-choice audience was women under 25, but across all audience categories, the numbers came in at roughly half the engagement level of Thunderbolts, Mandalorian, and Grogu, and Wonder Woman. The third factor was the film itself and how it sat with the people who mattered most to its commercial prospects: the established superhero fanbase. The Burbank press screening reaction reported by Deadline was pointed. Fanboys had zero patience for what they experienced as Craig Gillespie's homage-heavy visual language. Too much Guardians of the Galaxy in the aesthetic, too much Mad Max in the staging. The villain Krem described as two-dimensional and operating as if he had wandered in from Hellraiser. Jason Momoa's Lobo received a welcome response, but not a funny one, and the film needed him to be funny. The critics who responded more positively described it as a mixed bag with standout performances, undermined by adaptation choices and a weak antagonist. The less kind ones described the VFX as atrocious and the plot as uninteresting. None of this is a story about wokeness causing a film to fail. It is a story about a film with limited IP recognition. A test screening confirmed quality ceiling, derivative visual execution, and a star who spent the press tour generating negative coverage in the specific demographic most likely to determine opening weekend ticket sales for a superhero film. All of these things can be simultaneously true, and the interaction between them is what produced a $37 million opening weekend for a film that needed $315 million to break even. Gunn's own pre-release framing contributed to the cultural framing problem in ways he probably did not intend. When he described this version of Supergirl as harder edged than previous iterations, saying she was not like the female superheroes who are always so perfect, like male superheroes have been allowed to be for a while, he was making a legitimate point about character texture and storytelling range. He was also, as multiple critics noted immediately, handing the culture war media ecosystem a clip they could use to position the film as a feminist project before anyone had seen a frame of it. Whether the framing cost the film actual tickets is unprovable. That it generated a month of pre-release discourse centered on gender politics rather than the actual content of the film is documented. The edit war that nobody was supposed to know about. The most consequential story to emerge from the post-mortem coverage of Supergirl's failure was not the woke debate, the Alcock press tour controversy, or even the box office numbers themselves. It was the story about what happened in the editing room. The Hollywood Reporter published its post-mortem account of the production, and what it described was a situation that veteran Hollywood observers called extraordinary. According to THR's reporting, DC Studios and Warner Brothers took creative control of the film away from director Craig Gillespie in post-production. The studio brought in Ana Nogueira, the film's screenwriter and a Gunn collaborator, and Gunn's own editor to produce a competing cut. The two versions were then put against each other in a bake-off. The studio shipped its own cut into theaters over Gillespie's version, despite the fact that Gillespie's cut reportedly tested better on specific metrics: songs, pacing, and the handling of the villain, which is to say, the three specific elements that critical reviews most frequently cited as the film's weakest areas. Gillespie had been hired partly because of his documented ability to work with female-driven properties: I, Tanya, Cruella, the Emmy-winning Pam, and Tommy. The credits were the argument for the assignment. He took the job, he delivered a cut, he lost control of the edit, he was handed the attribution for the failure when the film opened, and the entire industry watched every step of that process. A franchise filmmaker not connected to the production, speaking anonymously to THR, described the studio's conduct during the post-production fight as not normal, specifically noting that a studio putting resources into a competing cut of a director's film is a signal that something is seriously wrong in the filmmaker-studio relationship. The Cosmic Book News follow-up report, citing Hollywood insider sources, was more direct. Filmmakers are hesitant to take on big DC franchises, and Supergirl has only hardened that hesitancy. The cautionary tale now doing rounds in Hollywood: you take an assignment from Gunn's DC, you lose control of the edit, and when the film fails commercially, you take the public credit for the failure. Gillespie's name is on the poster, Gunn's version is in the theaters. Alcock herself offered a telling piece of context without apparently intending to. In her Variety cover interview, she described trusting Gillespie completely during production, going to him at the start of pre-production to say she was freaking out and had no idea how she was going to do this, and finding that the relationship built from that moment of trust. She said Craig would come to her every morning with alternate lines, little things to make things funnier, and that she trusted him completely to tell the story in the best way it could be told. The director she described trusting did not make the final cut of the film she starred in. The second knock-on effect of the Supergirl edit situation, identified by Cosmic Book News, is about the current filmmaker recruitment environment at DC. Directors who have agents are watching the Supergirl post-mortem and asking questions about creative control provisions before agreeing to any conversation about DC projects. The films that Gunn has announced for the DCU's subsequent phases require directors. Getting those directors to commit in a post-Supergirl environment where the studio's relationship with Craig Gillespie is now public knowledge is a harder sell than it was 12 months ago. Dean Cain, the contract question, and what happens next. Dean Cain's campaign against James Gunn's DCU has been consistent enough to constitute a hobby at this point. He attacked the Superman immigrant framing in July 2025. He amplified a meme comparing Millie Alcock's appearance to a character from the 1970s series Land of the Lost, then walked it back when the backlash to his own participation in that exercise damaged his standing more than Alcock's. He has positioned himself as a spokesperson for the audience that the current DC Studios leadership has alienated. The older, more conservative, more aesthetically traditionalist fan who preferred a different kind of superhero story and remembers when nobody was asking whether Clark Kent had an immigration allegory built into his character. The Supergirl bomb has given Cain the clearest confirmation of his thesis that anything in the past 18 months of DCU discourse has provided. He has used it accordingly. Gunn has responded to Cain's various interventions with a mixture of direct engagement and pointed dismissal across threads and other platforms. He addressed the ear-piercing question Cain amplified, the fan asking how Supergirl could have piercings if her skin is bulletproof, with a perfectly logical answer about red sun planets and Kryptonian biology. He has not addressed the larger culture war positioning directly, which is arguably the correct strategic choice, since engaging it at length would only generate more content for the exact ecosystem he is trying to avoid feeding. The question that has moved from background chatter to genuine industry conversation since the Supergirl opening weekend is whether Gunn's DC contract will survive the pending corporate changes at Warner Bros. Discovery. The studio is in the process of an acquisition involving David Ellison's Skydance and other consortium partners. When corporate ownership changes at a studio of this scale, creative leadership arrangements are renegotiated, assessed, or terminated as a standard part of the transition. Cosmic Book News cited insider sources as far back as October 2025, claiming that Gunn would be out once the WBD sale closes, and noted that when the Hollywood Reporter's post-mortem on Supergirl arrived months later, it landed in exactly the same territory those sources had been pointing toward. Gunn's contract timeline is now running directly into the acquisition timeline with the next major DCU film, Man of Tomorrow, a Superman sequel with David Cornsweet returning and significantly more commercial infrastructure behind it, already filmed and positioned for 2027. Whether Gunn is still at the studio when Man of Tomorrow arrives is a question that the industry is now treating as genuinely open in a way it was not 3 months ago. The universe that needs a win. The collapse of Supergirl matters beyond the specific film's numbers because of what it signals about the DCU's foundational viability. Whether the first phase of Gunn's vision can produce a sustained commercial engine, or whether Superman was an isolated, reasonable result that the follow-up has now undermined. The commercial landscape for superhero films in 2026 is not the landscape of 2012 or even 2019. Audiences are more selective, more skeptical of franchise infrastructure for its own sake, and more demanding of individual film quality as a reason to buy a ticket rather than brand loyalty. Marvel has felt this too. The Marvels was one of the studio's most discussed failures, and while Deadpool and Wolverine and Avengers, Doomsday have maintained the franchise's commercial viability at the upper end, the mid-range standalone films are under pressure across the entire genre. What Supergirl established is that DC cannot expect IP recognition to carry a film that the internal test screening process identified as good not great. It established that a press tour misstep from a lead actor, regardless of the substance of what was said, can suppress opening weekend ticket sales in demonstrable ways. and it established that the studio's willingness to override a director's cut in post-production, while perhaps commercially motivated in every individual case, creates a chilling effect on filmmaker relationships that the pipeline for future DCU films cannot afford. The films ahead in Gunn's stated plan include Clayface, which has no release date confirmed, and Man of Tomorrow, which carries the franchise's most realistic remaining commercial opportunity before the acquisition timeline renders the creative leadership question moot. Man of Tomorrow has Superman at its center, a character with genuine IP recognition, a sequel that can build on whatever audience the first film established, and a returning star whose performance critics responded to in 2025. Peter Safran said in May that Alcock's Supergirl would have a major role in the future of the DCU beyond the Man of Tomorrow appearance already confirmed. Whether that future under Gunn's leadership remains the organizational context into which she returns is, as of right now, unclear. Gunn has said almost nothing specific about the Supergirl box office results in the days since the opening weekend numbers came in. He has not lost it publicly in the way the title of this video suggests. What he has done is stay quiet while the industry performs the comprehensive, merciless accounting of a major Hollywood failure, assigning blame, revisiting decisions, identifying turning points that look different in the rearview mirror, while the clock on his contractual authority at DC Studios runs alongside an acquisition process that neither he nor anyone else at Warner Brothers fully controls. The woke argument gives him nothing to fix. You cannot re-IP Supergirl. You cannot retroactively unconfirm a character's bisexuality. You cannot persuade the Fox News panel that they are analyzing the wrong variable. The good, not great argument gives him everything, because that is a filmmaking problem, not a cultural problem. And it is the kind of problem that a man who built Guardians of the Galaxy from nothing knows how to solve. Whether he still has the time and the institutional authority to solve it before Man of Tomorrow determines the DCU's fate is the question that the Supergirl bomb has made urgent in a way it was not before June 26th. $125 million. 2 films, 1 break-even, and 1 bomb. And James Gunn, quieter than he has been in years, watching and waiting.